Is there anything that money shouldn't be able to buy? Should you be able to purchase a new kidney, a university degree, the right to pollute a river? Today, these questions are highly ethical and debated. But Karl Polanyi argued that they're actually symptoms of a much bigger problem, a great transformation in which started treating human beings and nature as mere commodities to be bought and sold on the market. He called this a fictitious and catastrophic idea. So in this video, we're going to investigate Polanyi's claim that the most important things in life can never have a price tag, and what happens when we try to put one on them anyways. To understand Karl Polanyi's ideas, we need to understand the world he was responding to. Polanyi was born in 1886 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into a multilingual, multicultural, and politically volatile region at the crossroads of Europe. He lived through the economic and political upheavals of the 20th century, the First World War, the collapse of liberal democracy, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and the outbreak of World War II. In many ways, his life spanned the breakdown of the 19th century liberal world order, a time when free markets, gold-backed currencies, and imperial expansion had promised stability and progress. What Polanyi saw instead was economic collapse, rising inequality, and political extremism. In 1944, while living in exile in the United States, Polanyi published his most influential book, The Great Transformation: The Political and Economic Origins of Our Time. The title refers to the radical restructuring of society that occurred with the rise of modern capitalism, what Polanyi called the Great Transformation. In his view, this wasn't just an economic shift. It was a profound political and social revolution, one that attempted to re-engineer society around the logic of the self-regulating market. Polanyi's core historical argument was a direct challenge to classical economics. The self-regulating market was not a natural, universal form of human organization. Rather, it was a recent, radical, and state-driven invention. For most of history, he argued, economies were embedded within society, and the attempt to rip them out was the true source of the crises he witnessed. And when we try to disembed markets from society, when we treat land, labor, and money as if they were ordinary commodities, we invite social breakdown, political instability, and authoritarian backlash. In the decades since, Polanyi's ideas have become increasingly influential among historians, political economists, and critics of neoliberal globalization. But to understand why, we need to dive into two of his key concepts, market embeddedness and what he called the double movement. At the center of Polanyi's critique of capitalism is a deceptively simple idea. The economy is not separate from society, it's embedded within it. In most of human history, economic life, things like production, labor, and exchange, were governed by social relationships, moral norms, and cultural obligations. In other words, markets were embedded in social life. In pre-capitalist societies, economic activity wasn't governed by prices or profits, but it was embedded in broader social norms. Polanyi identified three main principles that governed these embedded economies. Reciprocity, or exchange based on mutual obligation, like between family or kin. Redistribution, where goods are collected by a central authority like a chief or a temple and then distributed back out to the community. And householding, or production for one's own use. These three forms, he argued, were far more common throughout history than the principle of market exchange. Land might be allocated through kinship ties, labor organized through family or religious obligation, and exchange conducted through custom, ritual, or reciprocity rather than through competitive markets. But with the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th century, something changed. Economic liberals like Adam Smith and David Ricardo began to imagine a world in which the market could be self-regulating, governing the entire supply and demand with minimal interference from governments, customs, or social expectations. This, Polanyi argued, was a dangerous idea. It sought to disembed the economy from society, treating the market as autonomous, self-regulating, and above all other institutions. But to make that vision work, liberal thinkers had to take a huge leap. They had to pretend that everything could be bought and sold, including things that were never meant to be treated as commodities. Polanyi called these fictitious commodities, and according to him, the most important of these were land, labor, and money. He called them fictional because they were never created for the purpose of exchange. They're foundational to human society, not products made for sale. Land isn't produced for sale, it's part of nature, our shared environment. But under capitalism, land becomes real estate, subject to buying, selling, speculation, and exploitation. When nature's treated like a commodity, the result can be environmental destruction, displacement, or unsustainable development. Labor is human life. It's people's time, energy, skills, and survival. But in a market system, labor is sold like any other good. When workers are treated as just another input in the production process, Polanyi argued we risk stripping away their dignity, security, and social value. And money is a social institution, a tool we use to coordinate economic activity. But when it's treated as a commodity, subject to speculation and capital flows, financial markets can create massive instability. We saw this during the Great Depression and more recently during the 2008 global financial crisis. Polanyi argued that none of these things were real commodities. They weren't produced for sale in the market. Trying to organize society around their commodification, he said, was bound to produce crisis. Why? Because society simply cannot survive being subordinated to the logic of the market. As he put it in one of the most famous passages in The Great Transformation, to allow the market mechanism to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment, indeed, even the amount and use of purchasing power, would result in the demolition of society. Robbed of the protective covering of cultural institutions, human beings would perish from the effects of social exposure. They would die as the victims of acute social dislocation through vice, perversion, crime, and starvation. Nature would be reduced to its elements, neighborhoods and landscapes defiled, rivers polluted, military safety jeopardized, the power to produce food and raw materials destroyed. No society could stand the effects of such a system of crude fictions, even for the shortest stretch of time, unless its human and natural substance as well as its business organization was protected against the ravages of this satanic mill. If disembedding the economy from society was the first part of the story, Polanyi argued that there was always a second act, what he called the double movement. The basic idea is this: when governments and elite try to extend market logic into all areas of life, when they push for free markets in land, labor, and money, society pushes back. It's the spontaneous, protective reaction of a society defending itself. People demand protections through new regulations, labor unions, and social safety nets to re-anchor the economy in social norms and values. This is the double movement. The first movement is the push towards market liberalization, deregulation, privatization, austerity, and free trade. The second is the counter movement, efforts by society to protect itself from the destructive effects of those reforms. Importantly, Polanyi argued that this pushback is not always progressive or democratic. Sometimes it takes the form of social welfare programs, labor unions, or environmental protections, but other times it can take reactionary or authoritarian forms, nativism, nationalism, or fascism. To Polanyi, this is exactly what happened in the first half of the 20th century. The drive to build a global capitalist economy anchored in the gold standard and free trade disrupted communities, depressed wages, and eroded state power. And when the system began to collapse in the 1920s and 30s, different countries reacted in very different ways. Some, like the United States under the New Deal, responded with social protections and public investments, an attempt to re-embed markets through democratic means. Others, like Germany and Italy, turned to fascism, a brutal top-down form of re-embedding that promised to protect society by both crushing labor and liberalism. Polanyi warned that when markets are allowed to run wild, people will demand protection, but whether that protection is emancipatory or authoritarian depends on the political context. As he wrote, the fascist solution can be described as a form of market economy achieved at the price of expatriation of all democratic institutions. That's what makes the double movement so important and so dangerous. It's not just about economic policy, it's about what happens when an economic system breaks down and how societies respond under pressure. Karl Polanyi was writing in the 1940s, but his ideas have only grown more relevant in the 21st century. Starting in the 1980s, many governments around the world began to embrace a new economic model known as neoliberalism, a topic we'll explore in greater detail in another video. Inspired by thinkers like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, neoliberalism sought to revive the idea of self-regulating markets by cutting taxes, deregulating industries, privatizing public services, and reducing the role of the state. From a Polanyian perspective, neoliberalism treated everything from education and healthcare to natural resources as commodities to be bought and sold. And just like in Polanyi times, the economy was disembedded from the social protections that had emerged in the post-war era. This process intensified through globalization. Capital could move freely across borders. Trade agreements like NAFTA and the WTO enforced market access, and structural adjustment programs led by the IMF and the World Bank imposed deep cuts to public spending in many countries in the global south. And while globalization lifted millions out of poverty, it simultaneously hollowed out labor protections, widened inequality, and weakened national governments' ability to respond to social needs. And then came the 2008 financial crisis, a textbook example of what Polanyi called the dangers of commodifying money and finance. Unregulated financial markets collapsed, triggering mass foreclosures, job losses, and austerity. And once again, society pushed back. We've seen that backlash in many forms: protests against austerity in Greece and Spain, the rise of populist leaders promising to take back control, anti-globalization movements on both the left and the right, and renewed interest in labor organizing, environmental protection, and economic justice. All of these, in Polanyi's terms, are part of the double movement, society's attempt to reassert control over markets that have overreached. But the challenge, as Polanyi saw it, is this: can you find ways to re-embed markets in democratic institutions that protect people and the planet, or will we repeat the cycle of liberalization, crisis, and authoritarian reaction? For Karl Polanyi, this was the fundamental tension of the modern world: the conflict between the logic of the market, which seeks endless expansion, and the needs of society, which requires stability, security, and justice. And understanding this double movement helps us understand the political and economic conflicts that define our time. But that's it for now. As always, please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.